Hi makers, Ruth here. In this video, we're going to be talking about painting and sealing our clay projects. Specifically, painting and sealing our clay beads and our clay pendants. Now, we're going to talk about a couple different ways in this video, so feel free to use whichever one sticks out to you. I want to show before we get started just a couple of examples of how our pieces might turn out. And this is just to kind of get our mind going so we can kind of think about what we want to do. We can have some more solid color paint. We're going to talk a little bit about how to turn that acrylic paint into a watercolor texture. And then we'll talk about a couple bonus things as well. And then we're going to talk about sealing our pieces to kind of protect them. But I wanted to show a couple examples so we can kind of see the variety of what we can do. So I'm going to go ahead and move these out of the way. And let's talk supplies. So the first supply that we need are illustrated instructions. And now you may remember from last week when we formed our clay pieces, we only did half of the illustrated instructions. For our clay beads, we just formed the beads and put them on the skewer to dry. So we'll continue that project today by painting and sealing. For the pressed clay, pendants. Again, we just formed it. We took our textured item, pressed into the clay, and then we let it dry. So we'll be able to do that painting and sealing today. We'll be able to finish it. It's always helpful to have those instructions, those illustrated instructions as kind of a guide through the process. It's also a great place to write down notes as you're working on it. The next thing we need is going to be our clay pieces. So go ahead and pull out the clay pendants that you made and the clay beads. Sometimes they dry quickly. Sometimes it takes a little longer to dry. The way to check is if you squeeze them, you'll see they're kind of like a squishy, firm texture. If it bounces back when you press into it, bounces back to shape, then it's dry enough to paint. If it stays depressed when you press it down, then it needs to dry a little more. Now, the reason we want it to be completely dry before we paint is that there's a little shrinking that happens. And so that'll cause cracks in our paint, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes that's a nice look, but it's something to keep in mind. So we're going to go ahead. I'm going to walk through, like I said, some different ways to use paint to decorate our clay pieces. So go ahead and pull those clay pieces out. The next thing we need out of our kit is going to be our paint. Now we're going to be using some regular acrylic paint. In your kit, you'll see a package that has 2 rows of paint, different colors, and it has 2 brushes, a flat brush, a wide flat brush, and a small round brush. One is for covering larger spaces and one is for doing details. So they're both really helpful. Go ahead and pull those out. Know that if you want to bring in some other acrylic paint that you have, definitely feel free to do that. We're using just regular acrylic paint. There's nothing fancy, and so bringing in that acrylic paint will work for this project. So go ahead and pull out your paint. The next thing we need out of our kit is going to be our Mod Podge. And so it should be in a container like this. This is a magic art supply. It can be used as an adhesive, which we'll use later on in this series. And it can also be used as a sealant, which is what we're going to be doing today. So go ahead and pull that Mod Podge out. You'll also need your silver handled brush. Now, the reason we use a special brush for the Mod Podge is that once you use a brush for Mod Podge, you can't use it for anything else. And that's because it kind of affects the bristles, kind of ruins it for painting. And so, like I said, once you use it for Mod Podge, it stays being used for Mod Podge. So that's why we have that special brush for that one. But go ahead and pull those pieces out. And those are all the supplies that we need out of our kit. Now, there are a couple things that we need that are not included in the kit, and one of them is a cup of water. This is just to kind of clean our brush in between paint colors. I'm going to be talking about a couple ways to use the paint, and so it'll actually be helpful to have 2 cups of water, and I'll talk more about that as we go through our process. But go ahead and get a few cups of water, a couple cups of water. And then it's also helpful to have a paper towel or a rag just to help clean our brush in between colors. Now, the last thing I want to talk about are some extras. These are things you don't have to have, but can be helpful. And the first one is a palette. This is really great, just a cheap little palette that you can get from like the dollar store. And it's helpful when it comes to mixing pigments. So you can make more colors than what you have in the kit. We're also going to talk about a couple different processes. And so this will be really helpful. And we'll see as we go through. The last thing I want to mention is kind of a little bonus. If you have some decorative napkins lying around, you kept them because they're pretty and you want to use them for something, this is a good time to use them. So I'll talk about how to use these to decorate our beads and pendants. Not necessary, but a fun little trick. All right, so let's get started. Let's talk about painting. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out my pigment here. I'm going to kind of set up my space really quickly. I've got my 2 cups of water, my paper towel, my 2 brushes, my pendants, my beads, and then my paints here. I'm also going to pull out my palette. All right, to get started, let's focus on our beads at first. So to paint the beads, it can be a little tricky. I have found that it's easier to paint them while they're still on the skewer. You can feel if you try to spin the skewer that they're kind of tight on there, and that's a good thing. It kind of holds it in place while we're painting. So if you're doing different colored beads, let me move my pendants out of the way. If you're doing different color beads like this, it's nice to have them separated so those colors don't bump into each other. So I'm going to go ahead and start painting. Now, for this first process, we're just going to paint straight from our acrylic. So I'm actually going to open them. And you may find it takes a minute to open the container. There we go. So I'm going to use some green. I'm going to do mine in different shades of green. So what I'm going to do is take my green paint, and I'm just going to kind of add that green paint to a couple of my palettes. So I've got about 3 colors of that paint. I'm going to clean my brush. And I'm going to mix some colors. In our palette, I only have basically 1 shade of green. And so I want to add some different colors to get slightly different shades of green. So for one of those, I'm going to take some of my blue and add it. Clean my brush. And for one of them, I'm going to add a little yellow. So I'm just kind of mixing colors, cleaning my brush in between. So now I'm going to take my brush and just kind of mix those colors together. Just going to take my brush and kind of mix those colors together. When you're mixing colors, you want to make sure that you're mixing enough for the surface you're going to be painting on. So I'm going to use my tiny bead for this first one. You can see I'm holding it. It's pretty stiff. It's not moving, so that's good. I'm just going to take my paint. You can see that green, now with the blue in it, is a really nice kind of blue-green color. And I'm just painting all the way around. And it may be, like I said, it may be a little tricky to add paint to those pieces. So I have found that it actually is helpful to keep it on that skewer. And we'll typically want to do at least 2 coats. I'm going to clean my brush, dry it off. I'm actually going to add a little more green to this yellow here. And just kind of mix that in. Now, if you already have a variety of colors and you don't need to mix palettes or mix colors, that's great. It's not necessary, absolutely necessary that we mix colors, but I wanted to kind of keep on a green theme here. So I'm going to come to my next bead and start painting. Kind of see my bead is pretty stiff, so I'm just going to kind of carefully hold it by the skewer and paint. And you may notice as you're painting that first layer, depending on the thickness of your paint, you may see streaks. And that's okay, right? That's okay. When we do that second layer, it kind of evens it out. All right. So what I'm going to do, so I'm not putting my painted beads on the foil. I'm going to set them on my tray here, so they're a little free from um, smearing and touching the surface. Lets them dry evenly. All right, and clean my brush, and I'm going to paint my next one. Mm. And again, we want to make sure we have enough paint that we're mixing to cover the surface. And so I'm just going to start painting my bead. And it may be hard, but know that to paint while it's moving. But know that if you do get it on your finger while you're painting, that this acrylic paint comes off pretty easily with a little soap and water. Mm, Great. I'm gonna clean my brush. And I'm actually going to paint my next bead this yellow-green color here. So I have two of the same color. So I'm just going to go through and do that. And because it's acrylic paint, it actually dries pretty quickly. So you may be able to do your second coat pretty quickly after you do your first one. All right. So I'm going to add some more of my paint here, and I'm going to go to that first one I painted and just add that second layer. And you can see it's covering up some of those streaks nicely. Mm, I'm just adding that second layer to my painted bead, kind of smoothing that surface. Now, we're just painting, what I'm doing today is just kind of solid colors of paint for the different beads. Know that you can do different colors, you can paint designs. It doesn't have to be solid color like what I'm doing here. Be creative. If you want to paint planets on yours, if you want to paint hearts on yours, feel free to do that. Be creative. So I'm going to use the last of that blue and do my second layer on here. And you can see as I'm adding those layers that it's kind of covering up those streaks, that second layer. And you can even do 3 or 4 layers of paint. It does make a difference. I'm going to clean my brush. I'm going to do my little bead on the end, that second layer. You can see because it's drying so quickly, um, that acrylic dries quickly, you can do your second layer pretty quickly too. So I'm just kind of spreading it out. If you're still seeing streaks and you don't want to see streaks, you just know that it may require doing a couple extra layers of the paint. So if I'm still seeing streaks on one and I don't want it to be that way, I can just add another and another and another layer. So you may find you need to add a few layers. Know that's okay. Know that that's okay if that happens. It's not that you did anything wrong. It's just that we need another layer of paint. The painting process can actually be really soothing. Just kind of doing that painting, especially when you're not doing designs, you're just painting surface. Okay. So I'm cleaning my brush. Okay. So those are my beads. I'm going to set them aside and let them dry for a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about painting our pendants. So there are a couple ways that we can do that. The first way, I'm going to open that up. The first way is to kind of paint straight the acrylic paint. So one of the things that you can do, I have a little bee that I pressed into mine, so I'm going to open up some more paint, maybe some black and some yellow. And so I have a little bee here. And so I want to paint him black and yellow. So I'm going to start with my fine line brush and just come in and kind of paint my little bug here. So I'm using just the straight acrylic paint. I didn't do any blending or mixing, but know that you can blend or mix this one too. So I'm just kind of painting the whole base of him yellow, painting his little wings. This was done for my signet ring, so I think he's really cute. Little bug here. Mm, neat. So I've got my little bee that's painted. And then I'm going to take my wider brush here. And I'm going to paint the outside. And again, for this one, I'm using just the straight yellow acrylic paint. And I'm just going to paint that ring around my little bee here. You can see I'm pretty messy, and so I'm getting the acrylic paint on me. But it's okay because that acrylic paint comes off with soap and water. So have some fun, experiment with the painting, right? It'll need a little time to dry, but that's okay. It'll dry pretty quickly, somewhat quickly, but just kind of have some fun with that painting part. And paint those edges too. So I'm just kind of going around painting. I'm going to clean my brush. And I'm going to take my fine line brush and bring in that black paint and just add a little stripe for my little bee here. I'm going to finish him off. Do my little wings here. Yeah. So I got my little bee is painted. So this is just using that straight acrylic paint, not blending, not mixing, not watering it down. That's one way to kind of paint our pendant. Another way is to water it down so we get kind of a watercolor look. And so I'm going to use this next pendant here that I made. It was an impression on a stained glass. And you can see it's got some pretty designs that are a little hard to see right now because it was a soft imprint. But what I can do is add water to it, add water to the acrylic paint, and it gives me this watercolor texture. Now it's air dry clay, so you don't want to do a whole lot of water because that'll soften the clay up again. But you can add a little bit of water and give it this really nice watercolory look. And so what I can do, I've got my paint palette here, the leftover paints that I use for my beads. So I'm going to use that. I'm going to come over to my clean water here and just kind of add water to the surface. I'm painting with water first. Not adding a whole lot, but just making sure that surface is covered with water. Then I get my brush wet and come over to the little bit of pigment that I have here. Just kind of mixing that with the water. And then I can kind of add it in places here. You see I'm getting some nice color. And I clean my brush. One of the things that you may notice when you start to do it this way is you start to see some more of those details show up that were really shallow and hard to see without the paint. So I'm going to get some clean water again and go in and do the same thing with my other color. Mix that in with some water and pigment, and then come over and do the same thing. Do a little tapping. You can see that color is blending. Clean my brush. I'm going to do it one more time with my other shade of green here. Get the clean water, come in and mix that paint, blend it in, and then just add a little bit of that color and clean my brush. So now that we've done, it's basically it, right? We've done straight acrylic paint where it's that thick coverage. I'm going to come down a little bit so it's a little easier to see what I've been doing. It's that thick coverage, right? And also watering it down just a little bit gives it this watercolor look. And so once that dries, you get a really nice textured look. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back, move this out of the way. I'm going to come back to my tray here where my beads are drying. Let me pull up a little bit. Come back to my tray here, and I'm going to very carefully add my pendants here to dry. Leave them to dry. I'm going to come back to my beads. Now you may have noticed that I have one bead that I didn't paint. Because there's a little trick. One thing you can do is decoupage. You can decoupage on these, which is kind of fun. And so I'm going to show how to do that with my large bead here. Right? So I've got my bead here, and I've got that pretty napkin that I had earlier. One of the things that I like about it are these pretty sunflowers. And so what I'm going to do is actually take some scissors and cut off some of the sunflowers and use that to put on my bead. So I'm going to cut this sunflower out here. So I've got my little sunflower here, and I'm just going to kind of carefully go through and cut it a little close to those petals. Just kind of trim it a little bit. You can see I just tore my napkin. Know that that's okay if it tears. Because we are kind of decoupaging it down, those tears won't be seen, which is nice. So I'm just kind of trimming my little sunflower here, giving it a little close cut. It doesn't have to be perfect, and you can see I'm not going right up against the leaf or the petals. You can, but it doesn't have to be that way. I'm just kind of cutting out all the other stuff that's on this napkin. So I have that little sunflower. All right. So I've got my little sunflower here. Now, with your napkin, one of the things that you may notice is that there are a couple layers. So if you're careful, you can pull off those layers so you have two sheets, right? So we're going to focus on the one that has the print on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to decoupage this onto my bead. Because I'm doing a round shape, one of the things that I'm going to do so it lays flat is I'm just going to make a few cuts going towards the center. I'm not cutting all the way in, okay? I'm just making a few cuts to help my napkin lay sort of flat. Okay? So the next step is to add the sealant, which is that Mod Podge, right? So what I'm going to do is open my Mod Podge up, and I'm going to dump a little bit of the Mod Podge into the cap. And then with my silver handle brush, I'm going to get some Mod Podge on my brush. And what I'm going to do to put my flower on there, what I'm going to do is paint it with the Mod Podge first. Right? So I'm just going to take it, and I'm doing a nice thin layer. It doesn't have to be super thick, but I want to make sure that that whole bead is covered with Mod Podge. So I'm just going to kind of take my time and make sure that's covered with that sealant. So We are going to be using this Mod Podge as a sealant in a moment, but it also, as I mentioned earlier, can be a glue. And so what I'm going to do now that I've covered my bead with the Mod Podge, I'm going to take that napkin that I kind of cut. I'm just going to lay it down on top of the Mod Podge and then just kind of press it down, right? And because we cut those petals like a little bit, they're laying on each other nicely, so there's not wrinkling, not a lot of wrinkling, shall we say. Right? And then I'm going to take some more of that Mod Podge and paint on top of it, right? Now the Mod Podge looks white, but the great news is that it dries clear. So that's good. So I'm just going to kind of add that Mod Podge on top. Now that Mod Podge is being a glue, right? An adhesive, because it's fixing the sunflower, that piece of napkin to the bead. But when we put that Mod Podge on top of it, it acts as a sealant, so it protects it. So what I can do, if I wanted to, I could flip it over and do another one on the bag, right? And so I'll take my, let's see here. Here's a tiny one, a smaller little flower here. So what I'm going to do is just kind of cut it out, trim it somewhat close. Pull off, whoop, pull off that second layer. So it's just that one thin layer in the napkin. And then even though it's small, it's helpful to do those little cuts. It just helps it lay flat. So what I'm going to do is flip it over, and because I already put that Mod Podge there, I'm going to lay my flower on top. That Mod Podge is holding it down, and then I can take my brush with more Mod Podge and just brush it on top. And I'm just kind of brushing it down. So it's flat, there are no wrinkles. Sometimes you may find some wrinkles in there. So it's just a little of extra working with it to get them to lay flat. And so now I have my green beads, and I have a little sunflower that I've decoupaged on top. And so then what I'm going to do is just kind of clean my Mod Podge brush in that clean water to get some of that Mod Podge off. So now we've got our beads that are painted. We've got a bead that's decoupaged, a little bonus there. And we've talked about two different ways to paint your pendants using the straight acrylic paint, painting in those details using that thick paint, or by watering it down and creating this little watercolor look to it. So yours is probably still drying like mine is. So I'm just going to set mine aside and just kind of show on some other examples here, different ways we can seal or how to seal our pendants and our beads. So these are some that I have painted earlier. They're dry now. You want to wait till the paint is completely dry before we add any of the Mod Podge on to seal it. Right? If it's still wet, what's going to happen is that when you put that wet Mod Podge on it, it'll pick up some of the wet pigment and it'll blend. And so you want it to be dry, completely dry, before we add the Mod Podge sealant. So these I did earlier. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of the same thing I did with that decoupage. Take my brush, get it in the Mod Podge, and then come over to my pendant and just kind of brush that sealant across, right? And as a reminder, you don't want to overwork it. You want to be kind of quick about it. The more you work it, the greater chance you have of picking up some of that dry pigment, making it wet. Now, it'll dry clear. It looks white, but it will dry clear. And so that's the solid paint one. This is the one I did with watercolor look, right? And we'll do the same thing. We'll take that Mod Podge, right? And just kind of brush it on top. It goes on white, but it dries clear. Now with the beads, it's basically the same thing, right? And I'll do this bead as an example. I'm taking that Mod Podge, right? Getting it on my brush and just carefully brushing around it. We want to be careful not to put the Mod Podge on the skewer because we don't want to glue our bead to the skewer. And so be careful with that. But you can see I'm just putting a layer around it and I'm going to let that dry. Once it dries, I can put another layer on it and it's completely sealed. It's probably a good idea to do a couple layers just to make sure it's protected, but it's just that simple. Adding that Mod Podge and brushing it across the whole surface. Now, that's simple in application, but holding it still on the skewer while you're doing it may be a little bit of a problem. So definitely take your time with it and be gentle with yourself. It may take a little extra effort, but it's totally worth it to have those couple extra layers of the Mod Podge on there because it acts, like I said, as that sealer. And so you can let those dry. And once they're dry, you can put another layer of the Mod Podge on there. Or you can pull out that embroidery floss and tapestry needle and go ahead and string up your beads or make a chain for your pendant. All right, everyone, happy painting. I'm excited to see pictures. Definitely let us know how it's going. Happy painting, and we'll see you soon.